Hello, I'm Mark, and welcome back to part 2 of my Unreal Engine tutorial on how to manage your sound mix and sound class settings from within your Unreal Engine game. As a quick little recap of what we did in part 1, we went ahead and created our sound classes, and then we went ahead and mapped these sound classes to our sound assets. And then once we created that, we went ahead and created our little sound mixer here and mapped those classes to our sound mix. And then finally, we went ahead and came into the project settings, came into audio, and went ahead and mapped our sound mix and made that the default base sound mix for our game. So what we're going to go ahead and do in part 2 is we're going to go ahead and create a data-driven sound mix override system so we can dynamically override the default sound mix settings from within the game. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and so let's go ahead and get started. So what I like to do first whenever we start building anything is to define our data structures. So first off, we're going to come down to C++ classes, and under Core Music Live, we're going to come into the public folder that we already created when we were doing the music system, and we're going to go ahead and generate 3 new structures. So to do that, we just need to right click here and say New Class. Now, Unreal Engine doesn't have a native generator for structures. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this empty C++ class here and we'll just convert this into a struct instead. So we're going to go click that, hit next, and then we're going to go ahead. The first structure we're going to create is our definition of what a sound mix override is. So I'm just going to go ahead and just bring that over here. And so we're going to call this sound mix override. It's going to go in the public folder. I'm not going to put any subfolders. We're just going to keep this kind of flat. And then we're going to go ahead and say create class. And we will let Unreal Engine and Visual Studio do its thing. Just going to go bring this up. And just wait for it to finish compiling. I'm just say reload all, so it reloads it into the project, into the right places. All right, and then once it's done, I'm just going to go ahead and, so the first thing we need to do in converting this from a simple class into a struct is to go ahead and bring over the generate information. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So the first thing is we need to have this soundmix override.generate.h, and this always needs to be the last include in our include setting stack. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put a decorator on here so that the Unreal editor will see this as a struct and go ahead and bring it in, and then we'll convert this from a class to a struct. And Unreal Engine, any structs within Unreal Engine always have a prefix of F, so we'll go ahead and do that as well. Have I spelled struct correct? There we go. And then we'll just, the constructor and the destructor, we'll just go ahead and satisfy those arguments. And I'll just go ahead and just tell Visual Studio to go ahead and fix these real quick. All right, and we also need to generate body. Okie doke. And that's all we really need to do to convert a class into a struct in Unreal Engine. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and define our structure's attributes. So one of the things I want to do is I want to make sure that to make our lives a little bit easier when we come back later to add this into a save system, I'm going to go ahead and create this little enumerator that I can use to then classify this struct for me. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring this in. So to create a enumerator and make it blueprint accessible, we just need to put in a little decorator up here. I'm going to call this enum and sound mix override type. And then these are the 3 that I'm going to have. I'm going to have none, music, and effects. And these are the 2 that we're going to be able to save within the save system when we do that in the next in a future video. And none pretty much means that this will not be enforced by any saved values when we get there. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bring in a little property. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create the classification by using the enum, and I'm just going to set this instead of music to none. So this is the save volume key, and this again will allow me to find this sound mix from within the save system in a way that doesn't require me having to do a loop of a loop of a loop. So that's what that's there for. I'm then going to go ahead and bring in our sound class. This is the class that we want to override when using our system, and I'm also going to say we need to have an include, and so we'll just use the soundmix.h include. Alright, so then after that we've got some additional properties. I'm just going to go ahead and copy them all in. So these are the properties which we're going to have the ability to override. We're going to be able to override the volume, the pitch, the fade in time, and then whether we want to apply these overrides to any children classes that this class may be a part, have. So once that is done, we've finished defining what a sound mix override is. So now what we'll do is we'll go ahead and create our table row where this sound mix override will live. So again, we're just going to come back to our editor. We're going to come to the content drawer, and then we're going to right click new class. Again, we're going to say none, come to next, and we're going to then go ahead and create the row, which will be used so that we can create a Unreal Engine data table from this structure. So I like to just make sure that any structures which are going to be used in data tables, I always put a row there. That way I know what the structure is going to be used for. So sound mix override row, it's going to be under the public folder. We're going to go ahead and create the class. Once again, we'll just let Unreal Engine and Visual Studio do its thing. Got a good compile. So we'll come back to here, reload all. Added it to the project, and now let's go ahead and convert this one over to a struct. So I'm going to go ahead and put the decorator on there. We'll just go ahead and rename this struct, put our prefix on there, prefix and prefix. Now I want to go ahead and make this, I want to be able to use this in a data table. So to do that, I now need to include, I need to have a include so that I can inherit from the table row base. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and put this include, so engine-/datatable.h, and in here I'm just going to go ahead and do that and say public, and then f. Should be f data table row. No, f table row. F table row base. And so what this does now is it's going to then bring in all the additional things that are needed for this structure to become a table row in a Unreal Engine data table. I'm going to add the generate body macro, and then we're also going to put the sound mix override row dot generated dot h include, and let's go ahead and just fix this real quick. Now we'll just go ahead and get rid of those. All right, so and one more for the destructor. Go hit save. All right, so now let's go ahead and add the properties. So here I'm just going to bring in So the first property I'm going to use is just a simple little ftext description, so I know what this sound mix is. Then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and have a pointer to the sound mix override, and I just noticed my little mistake there. I'm just going to go ahead and just do that and move that over to the row instead. Alright, sound mix, everything's happy. And then lastly, so that's the sound mix that we want to manipulate. And then the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to have an array of sound mix overrides that we want to that are associated with the sound mix, and these are the sound mix override classes that we're going to then, you know, update here. So to do that, and I just need to have an include here, and we should be good to go. All right, and that's our row. So then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create the save structure, and we'll use that a little bit later when we go ahead and create the application settings, but we might as well bake that capability in right now while we're still in the code for the components. So again, let's go back to the editor, come to content drawer. I'm going to go ahead and right click, new classes, none, next, and for this we're just going to go ahead and call this the saved sound volumes, and again we'll make it public. I'm just going to keep this folder structure flat. We'll create the classes. Hopefully we'll get a good compile. Yep, good compile. Reload all, refresh, and let's go ahead and just define what our save volumes is going to look like. So to do this, I'm going to bring in a reference to this sound mix override, because that's where my enum is currently residing. So we'll do that. We'll go ahead and get the include for the generate.h, which we need. We're going to go ahead once again and put our little decorator on there so that the editor will recognize this as a struct. Put the prefix on there and rename this from class to struct. We need to add the generate body function. So that's it. And then we'll go ahead and create some attributes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create this little user press set, and I'm going to set this by default to false. Actually, I'm also going to put those there. And I'll get into this a little bit later. But this is, again, will allow me to tell the to determine whether this is just being used as a default or whether this is actually coming out of the save system with saved user settings. Then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create the master volume, and then I'm going to create the two little children. The first one is going to be the music volume, and again the effects volume. And that's it for properties. The only other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add two small functions to this class so that we can then use that to kind of find the data as well as set our volumes relative to the master volume setting. So again, here's the first one: get sound mix settings. We're using the enum to be able, and that enum will tie to will correspond to either music or effects, and it will help us to pull the data without having to have a loop within a loop within a loop, which could be very costly within a gaming system. So that's there. So let's go ahead and add the implementation to these functions. So first off, I'm going to go ahead and fix the constructor and the destructor. So we'll just do that. And we'll go ahead and do that. All right, let's go ahead and define what this is. So I'll go potential fix. And all we're going to do is this is just going to be a switch. So the enum key comes in, but depending on what the key is, we'll either pick the music or the effects and bring that back. And if the enum key is set to none, we'll bring back the master volume. And then the second function is just a simple little equation. And I'm just going to go ahead and put that in there. And all we're doing is we're just saying take the value and then multiply it by the master. So since these are both decimals, then that should give us the right fraction back. All right, and that should be it for our data structures. So next, let's go ahead and create our sound mix override component, which we'll then use to interact with the sound mix override table from within the game. So again, we're going to come to the content drawer, we're going to right click, we're going to go to new class. Now this is going to be a class, and I'm going to make this a Unreal Engine object. So I'm just going to come up here, select object, hit next, and I'm just going to go ahead and just call this core sound mix override so I know what that object is. It's going to go into the public folder, and I'm just going to say create class. Just let Unreal and Visual Studio do their thing, and hopefully we'll get a good compile. Yep, we do. Good compile. Gonna hit reload, and now we've got the foundation of our little new component, which is our core sound mix override. So let's get started. So what I'm going to do first is I always like to put a little space between the actual generate. Again, this needs to be always at the bottom, otherwise you'll have compile problems when trying to compile your code. So then the next thing I'm going to do is I want this class to be accessible from within the Unreal Engine and from blueprints. So I'm just going to update the class decorator to include blueprintable, default to instance, and editable in new line. So there we go. Gonna hit save real quick. I'm then let's go ahead and just put in our public and protected zones. And I'm just going to go ahead and create a default constructor, and we'll just put it in the first public zone up here. All right, and while we're here, I'm just going to go ahead and just potentially fix that. So there it is. I don't need to put anything in here. This is just here to satisfy an argument, but that's it. All right, so next, let's go ahead and define some of our data, some of the data that this component is going to have. So the first piece of data that it's going to have, and it's going to be under protected, is going to be the current mix override ID. So this is the current mix row that we're currently going to be interacting with on a table. So, and this is going to, I'm making this a U property, edit defaults only, so it can be seen from within a blueprint read writable, and then I'm just adding a nice little category just to make it look nice and neat. So we'll call it sound mix override. The next, the data table. So again, this is going to be data driven. So all of our overrides that we're going to be using are going to come off a data table from within Unreal Engine. So we need to have a pointer to that table. And so here we are. Again, read writable, edit defaults, sound mix overrides dash override list. And that's it. And we're just going to make this a null pointer for now. Then I'm just going to add a little debugging variable, so I can turn any debugging statements on or off real quick from within the blueprint. And then that's it for the data. So let's go ahead and look at the internal functions. So the first function we're going to bring over is the valid sound mix table. So again, whenever you're dealing with data tables, you also want to make sure that this table is pointing to something and it's not a null pointer. So otherwise, if you try and interact with a data table that is a null pointer, well, Unreal Engine will crash horribly. So we don't want that. And then the next function we're going to create is the error message. So again, this is part of my debugging system. So if I have it turned on, it will then print out for me any debug statements. It's just a nice little utility function that I have. The next one is going to be our set base sound mix function, and this will take in a sound mix class and set. So if we have different sound mixers, this will set the game to use the sound mix that we put in. And then we'll have the corresponding sound mix override class, which is set sound mix override. And again, on this sound mix for this sound class, and then these are the variables that we want to change within that mix on that class. That's how that's going to work. And then lastly, I'm just going to copy all three of these in, but we just got some overloaded functions and these are the functions that we'll use to work within the table. So I just need to do one more thing here. We have a save volumes, so I just need to go ahead and make sure that this is included up here. All right, and then that should work that out. There we go. Gonna hit save. All right, and so that's our internal logic. So now, lastly, let's go ahead and just create our public signatures on how we can interact with this class. So first, I'm going to create the little init, and this is not going to have a decorator on it because it's purely done within C++. So I will just hold that there. Next up, I'm going to create a getter and a setter so that we can set the current mix override ID as well as get the current mix override ID from the table. I'm going to use a force inline since it's very simple. And so that's that. I'm also going to include a function right now that will allow us to go ahead and get the current overrides that are, so if we select a row, we'll be able to pull that row's overrides back. And this will be more useful when we work with a audio settings screen. And then finally, the external function that we'll then use to allow us to update the sound mix overrides based on what we want to pick. And again, that just takes in a volume and an ID. All right, so now that we've gone ahead and defined the signature of the class, let's go ahead and add the implementation. So we'll come back up to the top and just work our way top to bottom. So the isValid sound mix table, we'll just go in here and we'll just say potential fix. Let Visual Studio do its thing. So all we need to do, I'm just going to bring this over. We're just going to take a look at the table. If it's a null pointer, we're going to we'll execute this error message function and return false. Otherwise, if it's not null, everything's good, and we can then now interact with this table, and that's all this does. Simple little function. Error message, I'm just going to come down here. Again, this is a simple little utility function, and again, if the debug variable is set, then we'll go ahead and check to see if we have an engine. If the engine is good, then we'll go ahead and put add on screen debug message. And that's how we'll print out any error messages. I'm just going to print them to the screen. If you want to print it to a log file, then you can go ahead and just change this line. It's up to you. All right. Next is the set base sound mix. So we'll go ahead and fill this logic in. So I'm just going to bring this over. All right, and we have an audio device here, so I'm just going to go ahead and add that include up here. So that will satisfy that. And then all this is doing is it's taking in that sound mix class. First off, we're going to check to make sure that we have a valid sound mix. And then after that, we'll check to see if the engine is valid, and then if there's a if the used sound is valid on the engine. If all three of those are good, then we'll then come down and we'll then go ahead and get the audio device. And if the audio device handle is not null, then we'll go ahead and allow us to go ahead and set that sound mix that we're passing in. That's all that does. And then we'll go ahead and do the same thing for the set sound mix class override. So I'll just go ahead and do that. And again, same idea. We're going to check to see if the sound mix is valid, the engine is valid, and the engine is using sound. Again, check to make sure our audio is valid. And if everything's valid, then we'll go ahead and pass the information into the audio device and set it. All right. And then finally, let's get to our So these are overloaded functions. They've got the same name, but they have different arguments going in. Based on which argument goes in, just depends on how they want to be run. So we'll go ahead and set up the sound mix override. We'll do the first one first. And this is just my default, so I'm just going to go ahead and just copy it all over from my other project real quick. And we need to make sure we have the sound mix override row defined in our includes. And you know what, while I'm here, I'm just going to go bring in all three of those. So I'm just going to include the sound mix override row, and the saved volumes. And so then again, what this is doing is first, if we have a valid, as long as we have a valid table, we want to execute. If the table's not valid, or we have a null pointer, we forgot to hook our table in, this is just going to go ahead and return. Otherwise, then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll go into the table, we'll find the row by the row ID. Right, and we'll bring back the row if it's successful, and it's a pointer. We'll validate that we have a successful row back. If this ID doesn't match any of the rows within the table, then this will come back null. If this comes back null, we want to just fall through. Otherwise, if we found the row, now we can go ahead and work on the row. Again, I'm going to do another pointer check since we're dealing with classes in SoundMix. We'll just make sure that this row is not a null pointer. And then if it is not a null pointer, it's valid, then we have a valid sound mix on there. We'll go ahead and first set the base sound mix to the one which we want to be using, and then we'll go ahead and set the overrides. And then what we have is we just go into the iterate. We're just going to iterate right through the array, setting the sound mixes, for the sound mix row, and then each item in the array based on what we have, and that will then set the defaults to this new set of default or new set of values that we want to use at that specific time. All right, then the next one is to set up sound mix, and we're going to be passing in these saved volumes. So I'm just going to go ahead and say show potential fix. This one is going to be a little easier. Just one line, and it's just going to go ahead and call the other one, the next function, and all this does is it just takes save volumes. We're going to assume that we're in the current, this is in the context of the current mix override that has been set, and then we'll just execute that. And then the last one is just going to be here, and this is the one which we'll use if we have a valid valid save sound volumes coming from the save system. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this over and we can talk about it. So there it is. Again, checking to make sure that the table is valid. If it's valid, then we'll go interact with the table. We'll get a row. We'll check to see if the row is valid. If the row is valid, we'll also want to make sure we have a valid sound mix. If it is, we'll set that, and then we'll go ahead and iterate through the overrides. Now the difference here is that what we've got now is we've got the save volume key, and I'm using that enumerator so I don't have to do a loop within a loop. So we only have one loop here, and we can then use the switch to find the action, based on the category which we set in the type. It will then pull back the correct sound setting which is in the save system. And then lastly, we'll use the get relative to master to make sure we normalize that setting to what the master is. It sounds a little bit more complicated than it is, but when we get to the audio settings, it should all make sense. But that's kind of what that's doing. Let's clean that up. And so that should be it for all of our internal functions. Let's just hit save there. All right, so now let's go ahead and get the public facing functions done as well. So first off, I'm going to work, we'll define the init function. So again, come on, there we go, potential fix. And this one should be pretty easy. It's just going ahead and calling the setup sound mix override based on whatever the default is set up top. So that's that one should be straightforward. Then the next one, this is just going in and getting an array back. So we'll just go ahead and get the potential fix. And I'm just going to go find my code over here. Yeah, where is it? There it is. Copy that over. And again, always validate your table. Then once I validate the table, we'll go ahead and find it. And again, I'm assuming that it's going to be based on the row that I've already set. And then we'll just take the row, and then we'll just pass back the overrides, which is an array on that row structure. Otherwise, if this is not valid and this is not valid, we'll just fall through and bring back an empty array. And then lastly, we've got the update sound mix overrides function. So I'm just going to go ahead and this one is defined just like that. So here we're going to check to see if the check our ID. If our ID is not none, right, then we'll go ahead and set the current sound mix to that ID. Otherwise, if it is none, then we shouldn't really be. We'll assume that we want to use what's already there. And then after that, we'll go ahead and check our volumes, and this is where we have that user pref set. If the pref set is set to true, then we'll want to use the user's volume settings. Versus if it's not set to true, then we will use the defaults which were defined in the table. And that's pretty much it for the component. All right. So I think I'm going to go ahead and stop this video right here. In the next video, we'll go ahead and integrate this component as well as a table into our solution. And then after that, we'll then go ahead and play around with some of the settings, make sure it all works out so that we can then take a look at adding a audio settings user preference screen to our solution. So thank you for watching my video. If you like what I'm doing, feel free to like, share my videos, as well as subscribe to my channel. I will see you in the next video. Bye.